Around July 11, Russia stopped accepting applications for ships traveling through the Kerch Strait, which would pass into Crimea from Russia's Sea of Azov. The Russian-controlled Azov-Don Canal was similarly shut down. It wasn't a Ukrainian news outlet that brought this to attention, but Reuters, the world's largest independent news agency, and they reported something strange. The once busy sea lane simply came to a standstill. This raises several questions about Russia itself. No formal treaty had been signed. No fleet was seen sailing into position to establish its cordon. Instead, it seemed like Russia decided that even its own waters weren't safe enough for passage anymore, so it essentially shut the gate on themselves. And this is where things get scary. Blockades have long been one of naval warfare's most expensive and difficult strategies. A battle fleet, months of patrols, ships going bow to bow. And then there's Ukraine, a country which lost almost its entire navy years ago, with not a single major warship to show for it, apparently achieving the same result using cheap drones that skim across the water. And if you can make Russian captains too scared to leave their docks, you don't even need to sink an entire fleet. You just have to keep them in port. So let me answer the question which has been on my mind since I first heard these reports. Has Ukraine really pulled off what should take a proper naval blockade, and done it with drones so cheap they could be produced in some warehouse? If they have, that is unprecedented in this war. And rather than blindly celebrating it, we need to analyze the situation. There are claims made by Ukraine here which I don't believe outright, and I will explain why. But there is one claim that stands up to scrutiny. A claim that appears, at least for now, to have been substantiated. Russia itself closed its own water. But why closing that water matters so much? To answer this question, you need to understand exactly how vital this waterway is. The Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait are Russia's back door to the world, the artery connecting its southern ports with the open sea. They carry two commodities, each critical for maintaining a wartime economy. First, oil. It's here that many vessels in Russia's Shadow Fleet, a collection of older, unflagged tankers which Moscow relies on to transport sanctioned Russian crude while staying below Western price caps, operate most frequently. Second, grain. Estimates suggest as much as 25% of Russia's wheat export goes through the Sea of Azov alone. This means that it's not just one commodity at stake. It's two of Russia's biggest earners, both funneled through a single narrow passage, which makes Ukraine choosing to target ships passing through here all the more strategic and intentional than they may seem. Choking this small stretch of water doesn't just cut off valuable cargo, it targets the revenue that funds Russian missile production and disrupts global markets simultaneously. The impact was apparent almost instantly. Wheat prices on the Euronext exchange rose by nearly 4% following the strikes. If a series of drone attacks in one Russian sea can affect bread futures halfway across Europe, it speaks volumes about just how much cargo travels through that waterway. It's clearly not hitting symbolically important targets or key infrastructure like bridges. Instead, they are going for the heart of Russia's export revenue. And this campaign is far from a single event. The strikes arrived in waves over approximately half a week. July 10th, Ukraine's uncrewed systems forces claimed they had struck up to 13 vessels in the Sea of Azov, including multiple tankers, cargo ships, a sea tug, and a ferry in one operation. By July 11th, Ukraine added another 28 claims as drone strikes continued into the night on July 12th, claiming that for just the week, it was now at 90 total vessel strikes. We should stop right here to clarify what we mean when we say strike. It's important not to confuse striking a ship with sinking a ship. If a tanker is struck by an unmanned vehicle and begins taking on water or catches fire, it could still limp back into port. Let's be clear, this number of 90 comes straight from Ukraine. They are the ones reporting these numbers. While there's no reason for us not to take their claims at face value, but since the claim uses a strike rather than a confirmed sinking, we should not consider those as casualties or kill counts. If you need to inflate your numbers with claims that aren't backed up by evidence, it wouldn't be all that impressive. If this story was why you tuned in today, here's how you can support our coverage of the ongoing maritime conflict. Subscribe and give us a like.
The front lines at sea are shifting by the hour, and we have our eyes on every development. There is something particularly interesting about which vessels Ukraine seems to be targeting in its latest strikes. According to one Ukrainian regiment, it managed to strike 3 ferries at Kerch, important ships because of their role since 2022, when Russia began using them to supplement the damaged Kerch bridge, with ferry services for military supplies crossing from Russia into Crimea due to the bridge's compromised load capacity. Attacking those vessels isn't just about inconveniencing oil traders. It undermines one of Moscow's critical routes for delivering equipment and troops into occupied Crimean territory. But perhaps the most damning evidence comes not from Ukraine, but from within Russia itself. Overnight, leading up to the 12th, Rostov's governor Yuri Slusar claimed a drone-hit tanker was inside the Azov Black Sea shipping canal during its strike. The fact that Russian sources are confirming at least one such attack on their own waters is perhaps more than enough proof, even without any Ukrainian press release, that there are no safe seas left for Russia to traverse in this conflict. But why can't Russia just shrug this off? What makes it so effective against their oil trade? To understand that, you first need to understand the shadow fleet itself. These are aging tankers, often owned by untraceable shell companies, which Moscow uses to continue selling sanctioned oil without leaving a paper trail of its own. The very traits that make these vessels ideal for skirting international sanctions also make them perfect targets for drones. They're slow, heavy-set ships that ride deep in the water, and once they drop anchor to wait for their turn at a berth, they transform from moving targets into sitting ducks. A cheap sea drone does not need to outgun a warship. It simply needs to locate something stationary and vulnerable, and the Sea of Azov was packed with them. It's this realization that allows a small fleet of Ukrainian drones to effectively create the impression of a blockade. Because, in truth, you don't have to sink every ship at sea. All you had to do was make captains and insurers convinced that the water would take them. And as soon as Russia stopped letting its vessels through the Kerch Strait, it became official. And while this was happening on Ukraine's waters, what else was going on in Russia at those same moments? The strategy is starting to become apparent. FP-1 drones targeted a refinery in the Samara region of Russia, the Syzran plant operated by Rosneft, which processes about 8.9 million tons of crude oil annually, according to some estimates. According to the OSINT group Cyber Boroshno, the strike damaged the plant's main processing units and caused all of its primary refining capacity to become inoperable at that moment. A claim which I would note is an assessment based on open source intelligence and not a confirmed fact, but it fits perfectly into the larger pattern. The Syzran refinery had already been targeted twice earlier this spring, once in April and again in May. So we now know that Russia has essentially been caught in a pincer attack between two different offensive operations: attacks on its domestic oil refining capabilities and an ongoing campaign in the Sea of Azov aimed at its sea-based oil exports. It all points to one thing: a handful of relatively cheap drones targeting slow vessels and stationary industrial plants are slowly but steadily making Russia's own coastline a place that its tankers can no longer safely travel. So back at least to my initial question: can a nation without an established navy truly achieve most of the outcomes that only a true naval battle fleet is traditionally capable of? If anything we've discussed so far indicates, the answer is remarkably close. While you should take the ship counts provided by Ukraine with a grain of salt, after all, these are claims made by their own military. I don't rely on this information from Ukrainian press releases. The real proof comes much later, when Russia shuts down traffic to its Azov-Don Canal, refuses to allow ships through the Kerch Strait, and even its governor in Rostov admits that a tanker was attacked inside of the shipping canal. At that point, you can be sure your enemy has declared their own sea lane too dangerous to sail. Yes, it's a self-imposed blockade, one carried out not by an actual battle fleet of destroyers, but with cheap drones. And this is precisely what makes Ukraine's actions so impressive and worth exploring in detail. They've shown that even the smallest of nations can cut off access to its larger enemy's coastline. But let's not stop there.
There is no escaping the fact that these victories were bought at a heavy price. Russia responded in those same hours with guided bombs dropping onto Sumy, killing 5 people, among them a 13-year-old girl, and wounding another 30 in an area filled with crowds, a cafe, a transit stop, and a stretch of busy road. A missile strike on Odessa killed 2 more. While the sea campaign is being fought relatively cheaply, Russia's strikes against civilians inland are anything but cheap. And these retaliatory strikes continue to happen. The maritime front continues to unfold day by day. We need to see if the self-imposed blockade stands, or if a way forward will emerge for Russia on its own waters. If you want to follow this story as it develops, please subscribe and check out our earlier videos where we first uncovered how Russia's Shadow Fleet campaign began. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.